What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some reasons why you might not want the Cricut Icon 4. Now before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. Now, one thing I do want to point out before we actually get started here is that a lot of things I'm going to be talking about in this video are really just things you're going to have to deal with when you get a phone in this price range. So if I sound like I'm nitpicking, I am. But if you find yourself in a situation where maybe you're trying to decide whether or not you want to get a lower end phone like this, or maybe spend a little bit more money and get something a bit higher end, then the things I'm going to be going over in this video are definitely some things you're going to want to keep in mind. But that being said, my first reason why you might not want the Cricut Icon 4 is the storage. Now with this phone, we're getting 32 gigabytes of internal storage with micro SD card expansion, and honestly, 32 gigabytes in this day and age, while it may have been adequate 10 years ago, is definitely not a whole lot now. With stuff like apps, the system, and just files in general getting larger and larger as time goes on, even for more light users, unless you're really only going to have like 5 apps on your phone, the internal storage on this phone will fill up pretty quickly. Now, to be fair, this phone does at least have micro SD card expansion, and in certain situations, this can definitely come in handy. But still, if you're going to be downloading lots of apps and stuff like that, especially games that tend to take up a bit more space, you're definitely going to want more storage than this. And unfortunately, in this price range, really not a whole lot of phones have any more than 32 gigabytes. So if you are in that situation where you're a little bit more of a power user and you want to download a lot of apps, games, stuff like that, then I do recommend spending a little bit more and getting a slightly higher end device that has more storage. My second reason why you might not want the Cricut Icon 4 is the camera. Now with this phone, first of all, the camera is really featureless. Up front, we got a 5 megapixel front facing camera. Then on the back, we got one single camera, and this camera is 13 megapixels. So again, as far as features go, this phone really doesn't have a whole lot. No ultra wide camera, no macro camera, not even a depth sensing camera. So although portrait mode technically does still work with this phone, it really isn't the best. And speaking of photo quality, with this phone, on one hand, you can technically get some usable photos, depending on your standards. But if you're really taking a lot of photos you want to share somewhere, maybe on social media for example, then again, while the photo quality here isn't really terrible for what it is, if the camera is really more of a priority for you, I definitely do think you will want to get something with at least a slightly better camera. Even considering the price range of this phone, sure, with this exact price range, I mean, this phone retails for around $100. I personally got it for $60. You can't really expect a whole lot from the camera. If you are going to be taking a lot of photos, there are phones like the Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE, for example, that retail for around $160, which is really not a whole lot more than this phone. And with the deals Cricut always seems to be offering, a phone like the Samsung Galaxy A13 with a significantly better camera is most likely going to be just as affordable as this phone. So on one hand, if you're really not taking a whole lot of pictures, maybe you're just using something like Snapchat, for example, where the quality doesn't really matter a whole lot anyway, in that kind of situation, then yeah, sure, this camera is going to be perfectly fine. But on the other hand, if you are really taking a lot of photos, especially ones you actually want to share somewhere, then I definitely do recommend getting a phone with a better camera. Now my third reason why you might not want the Cricut Icon 4 is the processor. Now considering the price range here, this is most likely not going to be a surprise at all, but this is definitely not a fast phone. In fact, even compared to other entry-level phones, it is pretty slow. Sure, on one hand, for more basic activities like web browsing, social media, watching the occasional video here and there, and of course using the phone as a phone, it will at least get the job done. And if you're not really going to be on it a whole lot, it probably will be fine. But that being said, if you're more of a heavy user, if you're going to be on your phone a lot, you will most likely notice, again, this is definitely not a fast phone. And especially if you're doing things like mobile gaming, for example, they usually need a little bit more power to run well. In that kind of situation, if you're really using this phone for anything more than the basics, you are definitely going to want to get a phone with a better processor. Now I did run a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 5, and here are the results. So again, in general, definitely a pretty slow phone, and I feel like in this day and age, it's really not going to be an upgrade for anyone. But that being said, definitely run this test on your current phone, and then compare your results to these, because while again, this phone is definitely not going to feel fast to anyone, if performance really isn't a priority for you, then as long as this phone isn't a huge downgrade from your current device, you will most likely be okay. My fourth reason why you might not want the Cricut Icon 4 is the display quality. Now to give credit where credit is due, for what it is, at 6.5 inches, this phone is definitely decently large, and with the 20:9 aspect ratio, we're getting a taller and more narrow form factor here. So if you're doing something like watching a video in landscape mode, you're gonna get a more immersive experience. And if you're doing something like reading, browsing the web, using social media, stuff like that, you can fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. But that being said, one thing to keep in mind here is that with this phone, or really any phone in this price range, the actual image quality is definitely not the best. With this phone, we're getting an IPS LCD display with a 720p resolution and a PPI of 269. So in general, while on one hand, if you're really not going to be on your phone all the time, it is most likely going to be okay. And again, I definitely do do appreciate that we're at least getting a decently large display here. But that being said, if you're going to be on your phone a lot, then even around this price range, there are better options out there. And honestly, if you're really going to be consuming tons of content and just using your phone more heavily, then you might even be able to justify spending a little bit more and just getting something a bit higher end in general that's going to have a much better image quality. Another thing I do want to point out here is that although this phone does have decent brightness here, the viewing angles really aren't the best. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, or really in any bright area, it might not be the easiest to see. So on one hand, again, if you're really not going to be on your phone all the time and you don't need a crazy high image quality or anything, then again, this phone is going to be perfectly fine. And for that matter, pretty much every phone around this price is going to have pretty much the same image quality. So in that sense, this is pretty much the best you're going to get. But that being said, if you really are going to be consuming a lot of content, especially stuff like watching videos and playing games, then sure, some people are going to be perfectly fine with this phone. But if you're really expecting a great image quality, in that case, I might look into something a little bit better than this. The fifth reason why you might not want the Cricket Icon 4 is the cheap materials. Now this phone is made of plastic all the way around, and to be fair, the build quality is at least decent, and the phone itself doesn't feel like it's going to fall apart or anything. But that being said, keep in mind, again, this phone is essentially just made of a cheap plastic, and while I feel like most people looking for a phone in this price range aren't really expecting anything premium per se, just keep in mind, if you are kind of on the fence about choosing something a little bit lower end like this, or spending a little bit more and getting something higher end, if you are after a phone with higher quality materials, then the Cricket Icon 4 is probably not going to be it. And this brings me to the sixth reason why you might not want the Cricket Icon 4, and that is it doesn't really have any dust and water resistance. Now don't get me wrong, it's not any worse than usual, but there are some mid-range phones, like a lot of Samsung Galaxy A series phones for example, that do have IP68 dust and water resistance. And while on one hand, not everyone is really even going to need this, if you are in a more rough environment, like maybe you work outside a lot for example, and your phone is going to be a little bit more exposed to the elements, in that kind of situation, just keep in mind, this phone unfortunately does not have any special dust and water resistance. So in those more rough conditions, it's not going to be nearly as durable as a higher end device. So if you do get this phone and you are going to be outside a lot for example, I definitely recommend pairing it up with a case, because with a phone like this, that definitely will make a difference. And finally, my seventh reason why you might not want the Cricket Icon 4 is because it doesn't really have any long-term software support. Now on one hand, this is probably not going to be a big deal for everyone, especially considering this phone does at least have Android 12, which while not being the latest software at this point, is still a decently newer version of Android, and for a phone in this price range, that is at least acceptable. But that being said, keep in mind, with a phone like this, you can't really expect to get any major updates. So if you are someone who's more concerned with having the latest version of Android, then definitely keep in mind, a phone like this, or really any phone in this price range for that matter, is probably not going to be a great choice in that regard. But those were my reasons why you might not want the Cricket Icon 4. In general, aside from these more obvious drawbacks, for what it is, the Cricket Icon 4 is actually a great device. In fact, it even does have NFC, which I've never seen in such a cheap phone before. So in general, if you are looking for a really low-end device and you really just need the basics, no fancy features or camera or anything like that, then honestly, for what it is, the Cricket Icon 4 is still a great option. Now that being said, if you want to learn more about this phone, again, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipus Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.